Let me start off. I know it's really bad form to disagree with your organizer, but I do want to distance myself a little bit from something that Liz just said, which was that nobody predicted the economic growth that China would experience over this 30-year period. I think that's really not quite true, but I certainly agree with what she said immediately thereafter, namely that almost nobody anticipated that such a growth performance would be possible within the basic political framework of the Chinese Communist Party. Everybody more or less assumed that, it was very hard to envision change of the magnitude of what China was starting to go through, but we did sort of take it for granted that change would involve a broader set of political and social changes, or at least a different set of broadly based political and social changes from what we actually saw. So let me start out with in a way, this is sort of brush clearing, and hopefully I'm doing a service for all of us and for the panel, and just to try and separate that part of the Chinese experience that is far from miraculous. And that is to say that, in a sense, the basic overall economic transformation of China really is not a puzzle, it's not a mystery. It fits very, very well into most of our theory and understanding of economic change. In the first place, of course, China's growth miracle recapitulates what happened in Japan from the 50s on through the mid-70s, what happened in the so-called four Asian tigers or small dragons. And, it's a process of economic transformation that's pretty familiar. Dwight Perkins, Harvard's own Dwight Perkins, wrote a great little book in 1986 essentially saying, to oversimplify, that what happened in Japan and Taiwan and Korea would happen in China, and we would see this kind of dramatic growth. So I think in that sense, we could foresee the basic outlines of the economic transformation. And in fact, when you do these sort of cross-country analyses, once you plug in China's investment rate and the pace of structural change from rural to urban, there's not much of a residual. In other words, China sort of fits the cross-country pattern. So, okay, that seems to work out okay. It also, we can certainly add to this the fact that in the most recent decade, we certainly seem to be processing into a different kind of globalization, where earlier small countries like Korea, Hong Kong were especially well placed to link into the global economy, whereas now we see Brazil and India as well as China hooking into a new dynamism. Obviously, China has lots in its past that would lead you to predict economic success, very sophisticated commercial society. But more than anything else, China's investment effort was huge. So here's my required economics graph, right? The investment rate, that blue line, what it shows is from the beginning of the economic reform period, China's investment rate was already pretty high, 30% of GDP. And then unexpectedly, especially if you think about some of the rhetoric at the early period of the reform period, that investment rate then started to creep up. By the decade of the 2000s, the investment rate was pushing up above 40%. And of course, last year, in the context of a crisis emergency stimulus program, investment rate is around 46% of GDP. Absolutely unprecedented. So if we can say that China's overall growth transformation has many precedents, what we can't say is that the investment effort is similarly ordinary. Quite the contrary. It is the most dramatic devotion of resources to investment as a share of GDP of any economy that we've ever seen in world history. And so that's striking and needs to be explained, but at the same time it means that the growth experience is pretty easily explained by this massive investment effort. So this is the dumbest of all indicators that economists use to relate investment and growth. It's called an incremental capital output ratio. Very simple. It just says how many dollars of investment in a given year, or renminbi of investment, are associated with an increment in output of 1 renminbi. And so what this shows is when there are crises, this number bounces up a little bit, up towards 6 or 7. Those are the peaks in that. But that overall, China has a incremental capital output ratio around 3 that creeps up to 4. Namely, you have to put 4 renminbi worth of new buildings and machinery into play in order to get 1 renminbi out of increased output. And that is fine. That's a good level in comparative terms. That's what you'd see in Thailand or other middle-income developing countries. And it's much lower, in other words, growth is less expensive than it is in a developed country, which typically takes more investment in order to produce an increment to output. So when we put those things together, very large investment effort combined with a relatively stable bang for the buck, relatively stable return to investment. We don't see any indication that the rate of return to investment is declining in China. Of course, this last year is very special, very different, but in terms of long-term secular trends, which is all we can really use for such a simple measure. So in other words, the government was creating an economic system that poured resources into investment and thus into the growth process. Other aspects of the system were at least sufficiently robust that the average rate of return to this investment stayed strong. Well, you put those two things together, particularly in the context of an economy making the transformation from a rural to an urban society, and what you get is sustained, very rapid growth. You get that, you would expect to get it, and you do. What's surprising then is not the fundamentals of the growth process, but rather the fact that it was able to hold together, has been able to hold together as a powerful, dynamic whole throughout this extended 30-year period. If we say that economists did predict rapid growth, that's true. What they didn't predict is how rapid it's been, how untroubled it's been. I'm sure if you asked Dwight Perkins back in 1986, well, what's the average growth rate going to be? He'd say, well, I don't know. It could be up 8, 9, 10%, but presumably it will be interrupted by crises and problems at various times. And yet, when we look back over the last 30 years, there haven't been any really, really substantial crises yet so far. So growth has continued, and the result is China has grown faster, longer than any other economy for which we have any kind of historical records. So it's remarkable, but the question then that surges to the top, and the one that I want to leave as the legacy to the rest of the panel members after making a couple observations on my own is, what's the relationship then between this government-dominated system and the sustained high-quality growth performance? And in particular, why doesn't government failure impede this dramatic growth process? Because one thing we've learned is, although economists, and so I'm going to stop showing slides now and shift to just a conceptual basis, because one thing we've learned from the economic growth process in comparative terms ever since 1945 is that although the logical relationship between things like investment and structural change and growth is very strong, our ability to use these logical relations in a cause and effect way or in an instruments creating growth way is extremely limited. So even though there's this very, very strong relationship between investment and growth, logically and otherwise, when we look back at the experience of policymakers who've tried to maximize investment in order to accelerate the growth process, the result has been largely failure. In other words, when countries simply create mechanisms to launch a large number of large-scale investment projects, the outcome of these projects is extremely poor. In fact, in a large cross-country relationship, there isn't really a significant causal relationship between higher investment and more rapid growth in the short period in certain types of empirical work. So even though the logical relationship is strong, the causality is weak. The other mystery here is, why is it that state planning and state ownership, which seem to have failed so thoroughly in other contexts, have still managed to play an important role in this Chinese system where the return to investment has remained high? These questions point us to one obvious observation about the Chinese system, and that is when we start to ask the question about why the Chinese investment effort has been so large and so productive, we're immediately drawn back to the totality of the Chinese political economic system. In other words, there isn't a single lesson here or a lesson there. There aren't elements of Chinese practice that are so much associated with outstanding performance. Rather, what we see is a system that as a whole has been tailored, tuned, pruned, focused, and rebuilt around the process of economic growth. We say that the authoritarian system has been unreformed. And of course, certainly that's true in a way, in the sense it has never been democratized in terms of the way that many people expected. But the functioning of that authoritarian and hierarchical system has been very dramatically altered during the course of the last 30 years. And it's been altered according to the same kind of gradualist trial and error process that the economic system has been altered. The incentives that are at work in this system have been dramatically changed to reward people who foster economic growth, and also to a dramatic extent to foster investment as well. The monitoring system has been dramatically intensified so that the people who work for this system are under intense pressure to deliver results and are closely watched, in part because the temptations are so great. Career paths have been altered to reward the kind of performance the system requires. There's extensive consultation across different government agencies and with technocrats outside of the government in order to test out different kinds of policies. And the state enterprise system has been restructured in a way that allows state enterprises to raise substantial amounts of money as profits and through the banking system to then go further into investment and keep this investment system, this very powerful system, going. So in other words, when we look at the Chinese system, what we see is a system that's highly authoritarian, but still is tied increasingly tightly to the single goal of economic growth. Now, we don't know exactly what public opinion is in China, but I would say from my observations that economic growth comes about as close to a widely held social consensus in China as any other value. In other words, we see an authoritarian system tied to a set of values that are very strongly held in Chinese society, namely China should grow, China should develop, China should take its place among the leading developed countries in the world. And of course, China this year is passing the threshold of a middle-income country. So this objective is being close to becoming reality. Let me end then on this one point. This very tailored, comprehensively designed system has succeeded remarkably well. First, as a substitute for what we might think of as the Washington Consensus prescription of strong property rights, private ownership, strong legal system, and of course, ultimately, democracy. As far as we can see from performance, it's been an adequate substitute. Second, it seems to be extremely well suited for this stage of economic development where people are leaving the countryside, where massive investments are required, where it's relatively easy to predict the kind of infrastructure that needs to be built, particularly because you can look at forerunner countries like Japan, for instance. And so the question that, to me, comes up the most and that I'll leave us with is, will this system continue to be able to be a good substitute as China enters a new phase of economic development, as the people have left the countryside, as China increasingly is an urban society, as the choices for investment become less obvious, as the demands for consumption become larger and more varied, will this system continue to be a well-tailored system? And if it isn't, what's going to replace it?